So not too long ago, I was scrolling around the old PB. For those of you that are not familiar with the channel, that's what we call the Pottery Barn, and came across this super cool vintage looking sled that looked a lot like this. So I took one look at the price and saw the $250 price tag. My maker brain kind of went crazy and I said, I can build that. And after putting my twist to it, this is what I came up with. So in today's video, I'm going to be teaching you just how easy that it was to make this vintage looking sled. And not only did I not have to pay $250 for this thing, I was able to build this out of a single 8-foot 2x12. And if you were going to be building these things in bulk, you could actually get 3 of these out of 2 2x12s. This thing was a lot easier to make than what I anticipated. And I only had to use a few common tools. So you ready to learn just how easy that it is to build this guaranteed bestseller? Well, let's get started. So to start off with building this super cool rustic sled, we're going to start with the hardest part, which really isn't hard at all. And that's going to be the runners. So I want each one of these runners to be 3 foot long and have that traditional curl back on the end. Most of the time this was done with laminating for durability, but since we're just making this as a decorative item, we're going to be using a single 2x12 and we'll make the whole project with it. So whenever you're picking out your material, try to find a 2x12 with the least amount of knots as possible, and especially these big knots. I wasn't paying close enough attention and I got one with a big knot in the middle. It happens. So we're going to work around this. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to cut 3 foot off of one end. So in my case, that's going to keep us from getting into that knot. And as always, I'm going to be teaching you step by step on how to make this super cool sled, but if you're a plans in the hand type of person, head over to my website. I'll make sure to throw a link in the description. And for my cutoff piece, I'm going to leave it whole. And you'll see why here in a minute. So starting off with my 3-foot board, the idea is to go up 1 inch down one side, get to a certain point, and then start arching in and make that traditional curved front end. Let me show you how to lay this out really easily. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to find the nicest edge of the board. I'm going to make that the bottom of our runner. And for the opposite edge, I'm just going to put a little X. That way I know which side that I'm working with. Since I've chosen this side to be my bottom, I'm just going to put a little B here and a T at the top. And again, I just like to mark things out just for reference. So now on the top side of my board, I'm going to measure over 3 inches and make a mark on the edge. And then for the bottom of the board, I'm going to measure over 5 inches and make a mark on the edge. We'll be using this as reference points for our arch. So a lot of people cannot stand drawing arches or circles and things like that, but I tend to try to just use the things that I have laying around, like this cheap metal ruler that doesn't read right anyway. But it's perfect for making arches. And one last thing to mark out just as a reference before I actually start to draw my arch is going to be the height of my runner. And I want each one of these runners to be 1 inch tall and 1.5 inches wide. And now we're just going to transfer our 5¼ inch mark up to our new line. This is going to show us where our arch is going to connect. And if you don't have a ruler to bend up and you choose to purchase the plans for this, I'll make sure to throw in a template for this arch. Now it's time to make our arch with either your ruler or your template. If you're using a ruler, here's a neat little trick that I like to use with painter's tape. I'm going to line the top of my ruler up with the top 3 inch mark, give a little pressure in the middle, then line the bottom up with the very bottom 5 inch mark. And I just kind of shape it until I get it into the position that I like. Once I have that, I'm going to attach the other end of my painter's tape to my ruler. And now I have my arch template. And the good thing about doing it this way is if you want a little different shape, it's easy to adjust. Then once you have your template just how you want it, we'll just trace around the outside. And for some reason, after you've shaped your ruler, it's not quite long enough to go all the way to the edge. Just pick it up and use it to finish out your arch. And I'm just going to mark little X's on my cutoff section. So don't put away your template yet because we still have to mark the inside of our arch. And then to mark this out, now we use the mark that we transferred earlier onto our line and measure over 1 inch. And from the top, we'll measure 1 inch over from our 3 inch mark. And in the very center, we'll measure 1 inch in. So now with those 3 points marked, we'll adjust our arch template to match. Then on my top side, I'm going to measure 3 3/4 inch from the edge, make my mark. Then you just adjust your ruler to match your marks. And if you notice that I left my top just a little thinner than the bottom, that's just going to be for looks. Once you have everything lined out, go ahead and trace it out. Now you can cut this arch several different ways. I'm going to be using a jigsaw, you can use a router, you can even use a handsaw, whatever that you would like. But if you're going to be using a jigsaw, make sure that you're using a good thick blade with an aggressive tooth. And for now, we're only going to cut off the outside. So now you could take your jigsaw and cut all the way around and down, but I'm going to get a little help from the table saw by ripping this 1-inch section all the way down until my arch starts. This is just going to cut down on the amount of jigsawing that I have to do. I'm going to go ahead and shut off my saw about 1 inch away from my mark, just to account for the blade extension on the bottom. Now I can go ahead and finish my outside line with the jigsaw. Okay, so we now have our first runner cut. If you do not want to finish this sled up, you could also use it as a giant cane. Up to you. So I have some exciting news, especially for those who like the way that I teach. Woodworking Kickstart from Novice to Natural is launching soon. So whenever I first decided to dive into woodworking as my full-time career, I had one goal in mind: to reach and teach. I wanted to design a course that anyone could take regardless of skill level, and teach that course in a way that anyone could understand. And we'll start from the very basics, ensuring that you have a solid foundation to build from. Each project is carefully designed to introduce new skills to build upon skills that you've learned in the previous project. And by using this method of progressing step by step, you'll find yourself ready and even excited to tackle the next challenge with confidence. So I figured out a long time ago, the best way to teach someone to do anything is if they're right there with you. And that's exactly what I do during this course. By doing it this way, you're going to get the same attention to detail and practical advice, just as if we were working side by side. Each project is more than just a thing. It is an opportunity to learn a new set of skills, how to troubleshoot and tackle problems that we may run into. And that's just a drop in the bucket. So if you keep that learning mindset, my goal for you is by the end of this course, you'll have the knowledge and confidence to build anything that you want. So while we're putting the final touches on the course, in the meantime, you can go to the course website, and I'll make sure to throw a link in the description, and you can check out what this course is all about. This is what I was talking about with the table saw, with accounting for the bottom of the blade. Even though on the front I stayed off of my mark about 1 inch, on the back, because of the down cut of the blade, it extended on out. So really, just to be on the safe side, I should have stayed away from my mark about 2 inches. Now I know. I'll put a little bit of wood filler in this, and by the time we get done sanding this up, it won't even be noticeable. And now to make our second runner, we'll just grab our extra long piece that we had setting aside, and we're just going to repeat this process that we did for our first one, finding the best edge to use as our bottom. But the good thing about making this one is now we have a template to go off of. Now we'll just lay out our first runner so that everything matches, and then trace it out. And we'll cut this out the exact same way that we did for our first. Just if you're using the table saw, be mindful to stay away a couple of inches from your curve. So the material for your second runner should be right around 5 foot long. We're actually going to keep it at that length. So the bottom of your runner is going to be extra long whenever you have it cut, but we'll just trim that down to 3 foot to match our second one. The reason why we're doing all of this is because if we cut this down to 3 foot, then we won't have enough material left for our parts. Okay, so now that we have our 2 runners cut, we'll go ahead and cut the second one down to 3 foot to match the first. And our leftover material, let's go ahead and just set this to the side because we're going to be needing this here in a minute. So now with both of our runners cut to length, let's go ahead and sand all of this up so that everything's nice and smooth. Okay, so now that we have our runners sanded down nice and smooth, let's go ahead and start cutting the rest of the parts. So for that, I'm just going to square up the ends of my boards that I made my runners out of. Then we'll head to the table saw to rip these down to different sizes. So the shorter of the 2 boards, I'm going to rip this into 1-inch strips. That's going to leave it at 1 inch by 1.5 inch. I'll cut 3 or 4 of these strips just to be on the safe side. Now I'm going to take a couple of those strips to the miter saw, set it at 20 degrees, and then with the 1.5 inch face laying flat against my table, I'm going to make this first 20-degree cut on the end. Then from the tip of this cut, I'm going to measure down 7 inches, bring my saw back to 90 degrees, and then cut it flush. And since I'm going to be needing 4 of these parts, I'll just repeat this 3 more times. So now we have 4 seat braces. And then the non-angled side of these seat braces will actually be attached to our runner. That way, whenever we angle this in, the 20-degree miter that we put on the ends of these will make everything level. So let's go ahead and get these braces attached. And to do this, I'm going to make a mark at 2 inches from the end of a runner, and then at 21 inches. I'm just going to square these marks up. Then I'm just going to draw a reference line at this mark. Starting with the 2-inch reference line, I'm just going to set the left side of my brace against that, and then just trace out the right side. Then for the 21-inch reference line, I'm going to set the right side of the brace against the line, and then trace out the left side. After doing this for both runners, I need to pre-drill some holes. And now I have a reference. So I want to be able to put a screw in each one of these. So I'll start off by drilling a hole in the very center of each one of my brace marks. So now that we've pre-drilled through our runners, we can lay our runner on its side and pre-drill our brackets by laying the long edge against the table, lining it up with our marks on the front, then use the pre-drilled hole on the bottom for your bracket. This is just going to ensure that our bracket doesn't split whenever we install our screw. So to pre-drill our second runner, we need to flip it around facing the opposite direction of our first. So with it facing this way, we can do the exact same steps as we did for our first one with the long edge of our brace against our table. So before we glue and put a screw in this, I'm going to go ahead and counterbore each one of these. Now you don't necessarily have to counterbore, you can countersink these if you would like. Just something to hide the screw and also keep it from cracking your runner. Now that we have everything pre-drilled and counterbored, let's go ahead and screw these into place. I'm using 1 1/4 inch screws for this. If you chose not to counterbore, I would at least put in 1.5 inches. Alright, so our little sled here is starting to come together. So the next thing that we're going to do is install our seat supports. And for our 2 seat supports that we'll be needing, we'll be using the same 1 inch by 1.5 inch strips that we cut earlier. We'll need 2 of these cut down to 16 inches. So now with my 2 supports cut, I'm going to go ahead and mark my spacing to pre-drill and counterbore. So I'm going to mark 2 3/4 inch from each end and then center. And even though the bit that I have in this counterbore isn't quite long enough to get through this, I'm going to go ahead and counterbore first, then we'll pre-drill once we attach it to our braces. So we're going to start by attaching these to our right-sided runner. I'm just going to apply some wood glue at the top of my braces. Then I'm going to set my support onto my brace and then measure it from underneath so that there is 2 inches of overhang. Once I have my overhang spacing, now I want to make sure that it's centered. So I'll check the sides to make sure that there's 1/4 inch of overhang there. Once I have everything lined up, I'm just going to finish the pre-drill using the hole from the counterbore, double check for movement, and then install my screw. Since this shifted just a bit with that screw, let's double check our overhang again and square this up. So now that we have both of our supports attached to one side, let's flip this around and just repeat the process for the second side. So now we have a frame of a sled. It's looking pretty cool. So now that's all that we have to do is make our seat slats and our runner supports. And for that, we'll be using some more of our leftover material. So to start with, I'm going to set my table saw fence to 1 inch and I'll rip 2 boards at this width. So for the rest of these parts, I'm going to use what's left of our longer board. I'm going to start off by making our 2 runner supports. And each one of these will end up being 38 inches long. Now I'm going to bevel my saw blade to 20 degrees. So with our 2 strips cut and our blade beveled to 20 degrees, let's move our fence into 5/8. So with the 1.5 inch side of our material laying against our table, let's run these 2 parts through the saw. Right, so the reason why we cut it like this, we can end up with a finished product that is 1 inch on 2 sides and also has a 20-degree angle. You'll see where that comes into play here in a minute. But ultimately, your runner support should look something like this. And then to cut our seat slats, let's go ahead and set our saw back to 90 degrees or 0 on the plate. And then we'll set our fence to 1/2 inch. Still using this same board, we're going to cut 6 more slats that will end up being 1/2 inch by 1.5 inches. So now with our 6 slat boards cut, let's go ahead and get these cut down to size. Then we're ready to start putting all of this together. I'm going to start off by cutting these all down to 26 inches long. Once I have them all cut to length, I'm going to make a mark on one end at 3/8 of an inch from the side. And then I'll flip the board and make the exact same mark. And I'll just repeat this for all of my boards. And the reason for doing this is just to add a little bit more character to these slats. Now with our boards marked, let's set our saw to 45 degrees to the left. And then whenever we go to make our cut, we'll just line it up with the mark that we've made. We'll make that cut, flip the board over, and do it for the other side. And we'll just repeat this for the rest of our slats. Right, so with our parts cut, we can kind of see what this thing is going to look like, and it's going to look pretty cool. Let's go ahead and get everything stained up the way that we want it. It's going to be a lot easier staining these parts before we actually attach it. Then once we get that knocked out, it's just attaching our slats to our frame. And after doing a bit of touch-up sanding on the new parts, I decided that I wanted to stain mine for a vintage look. If you're curious about the stain that I'm using, it's called Midnight Mahogany by Cabot. This stain was actually recommended to me by one of the Patreon members, and I love it. Other options that would look really good with this is to paint the base and then just stain your slats. This is the creative part of the project where you can do you. All right, so now that we have our part's pretty much stained up. We'll have to go back as we attach some of these items just to kind of touch up some of the stain. But for the most part, the staining's done. It's going to make it a lot easier in the long run. So the next thing that we're going to install are going to be these sled supports. Whenever you put these down, put the 45-degree angle with the smaller of the two edges against your runners. So to get this positioned the way that we need it, we need 3.5 inches of overhang. I'll go ahead and set this one up as well. 3.5 inches. And you want 1.5 inches from the edge of each one of your supports. So with our runner supports in place, just to keep this from moving on me while I work, I'm just going to clamp it to the front end. And then to attach this to my support, I'm just going to counterbore straight down and then install a bronze screw. Now really you can use any type of screws that you want, and then you could just actually come back in here and put a piece of dowel in, cover that screw up. Since I have some of these bronze screws, I'm just going to go ahead and use those. And again, I'll come back here in a bit and add some stain to these holes. Now with those two screws in place, let's attach our front. And for this, you're going to have to look at this to see where it's going to connect to both, because your arch may be just a little bit different than mine. But the way that mine is falling, it's going to be 2.25 inches. I'm going to put this screw right in the center. And just like before, I'm going to counterbore and install a screw. Now I'll just turn this thing around, repeat the process for the opposite side. Okay, so now that we have both of our runner supports in, we have a nice sturdy frame here. And most of the time, if you're using this for decoration, it's either just going to be sitting out somewhere or it's going to be hanging off of a wall. So up to this point, I've used screws for everything in case someone wanted to hang this up. Now it's going to be up to you whether you use screws for these slats or not. It's really not any point of this sled that's going to be exposed to a lot of pressure or anything. So actually some wood glue and brad nails will be just fine. But if you'd like to put screws in this, go for it. But to install these slats, we're going to start off just by laying them out to get equal spacing. Now again, I'm not going to give you an exact measurement on this because yours may be spaced out just a hair different than mine. This is going to be one of those things that is best done just by eyeballing it. So once you have your left to right spacing about where you want it, now let's space it vertically. So my two outer boards, I want those even with my supports. I want it 1/2 inch further up than my first board. And the same thing on the opposite side. And these two boards in the center, I want those 1/2 inch further up than my second board. And by doing that, it gives the front this traditional kind of decorative arch. So once I have everything where I want it, I'm just going to take a straight edge, lay it across my board. And you'll do this whether you're putting screws in or nails. You just want everything to kind of be uniform. I'm just going to put a mark in the very center of each board. And I'll do the same thing for the front. So now that we have all of our boards marked, let's go ahead and install these. I'm going to start with the two outer boards. I'm just going to find my mark, and then on the back, put some wood glue on, and the same thing for up at the top. And once I have my spacing back, I'm going to install my brad nail. Then I'm going to do the same thing for the opposite side. Just keep repeating this and working my way into the center. And there we go. The only other thing that I would do to this is maybe mount some D-rings in the front, then maybe put a piece of an old rope or something like that on there. Other than that, I think this thing looks pretty awesome, and that just goes to show you that with a little bit of patience and creativity, you can accomplish anything.